It was the year 1944. The world was drowning in the fires of war. Europe lay shattered beneath the thunder of bombs, its cities burning, its people weary. Across the seas, in the United States, a different world existed, a land untouched by invasion, where factories roared with production and trains carried endless supplies of food, uniforms, and weapons for captured German soldiers torn from the collapsing battlefronts and shipped across the Atlantic. Their journey into captivity felt like stepping into another planet. They had been raised to believe that America was decadent, soft, and incapable of discipline. Yet as they disembarked into sprawling POW camps across the American countryside, they were met not with cruelty, but with something utterly unexpected. Every morning, before the work details and camp routines began, an aroma drifted across the barracks. It was rich, warm, and deeply familiar. Coffee. Not the weak, bitter substitute they had been reduced to in wartime Germany, but real, fresh-brewed American coffee. It was served not as a rare treat, but as a daily ritual for these prisoners, men who had expected punishment, deprivation, even starvation. The simple act of being handed a steaming cup of coffee was nothing short of astonishing. Some sipped in silence, too shocked to speak. Others closed their eyes, letting the taste transport them far from barbed wire and captivity. And in that moment, surrounded by enemies, they experienced something almost unthinkable during war: comfort. The story of German POWs and their astonishment at this daily ritual is not just about coffee. It is about humanity revealed in the smallest details, about cultural shock wrapped in the steam of a morning cup, and about the clash between expectation and reality in the most unlikely of places. The memory of that first cup lingered in the minds of countless German prisoners for decades, etched as deeply as the sound of marching boots or the sight of barbed wire. It was 1944, and the war had stripped Europe bare. For years, Germany had been cut off from imports, its ports blockaded, its factories bombed, its rail lines shattered. The simple luxuries of life, items once so common they barely deserved a thought, had vanished into scarcity. Coffee was one of them. Real coffee had become almost mythical in Germany, a distant memory tied to childhood kitchens and the smell of breakfast in peacetime. Families had long since turned to desperate substitutes, grinding roasted acorns, chicory, or even dried sugar beet, to create bitter brews that carried only a shadow of the flavor they once knew. Housewives whispered recipes to one another, tinkering with roots and herbs, trying to disguise the loss. But nothing could mask the absence. To hold a steaming cup of actual coffee had become a dream so far away that most men at the front stopped hoping for it at all. When German soldiers were captured and transported across the Atlantic, they braced themselves for hunger. Their officers told them not to expect kindness. They imagined cold meals of watery soup, rough bread, and little else. They imagined being treated as animals, caged and starved, reduced to nothing more than defeated enemies. But when dawn broke over the POW camps of America, something entirely different happened. In the chill of the early morning, as the sun stretched across wooden barracks and long shadows cut through the barbed wire fences, prisoners smelled something that made them stop in their tracks. It was unmistakable. The rich, earthy aroma of roasted beans carried through the camp like a memory pulled from another world. Some men turned toward the smell in disbelief. Others shook their heads, convinced their noses were playing tricks. Yet as the Americans wheeled out tall metal urns and began pouring the steaming liquid into tin cups, the impossible became real. The Germans lined up in silence. For many, their minds raced with suspicion. Was this truly coffee? Could it be? The line shuffled forward, and one by one, hands extended, trembling slightly as metal cups were filled with dark, steaming liquid. The first sips were tentative. The warmth touched their lips, and then the flavor spread across their tongues, bold, rich, unmistakably real. Not the burnt bitterness of chicory, not the dull flatness of barley, but coffee, true coffee, the kind their mothers brewed in kitchens years before the world had collapsed into fire. For a moment men closed their eyes. Some inhaled deeply, letting the steam rise into their faces, almost afraid to drink too quickly, afraid the moment would vanish. The power of that coffee was not just in its taste, but in what it represented. These were men who had spent months and years in battlefields of mud, snow, and blood. They had marched on empty stomachs, fought through exhaustion, and known nights of hunger so sharp it gnawed at the bones. In Germany, even civilians starved. Yet here in captivity, the first act of the morning was not deprivation, but abundance. The Americans did not ration it into small droplets. They poured generously, cups brimming as though the supply was endless. And in truth, for America, it was. Coffee flowed through the ports of New York, New Orleans, and San Francisco, brought in from Brazil and Colombia, roasted by the ton, packed into tins and shipped across the nation. For Americans, it was an ordinary part of daily life, something no one thought to withhold even from their enemies. To the Germans, this generosity was incomprehensible. They had been raised under a system that preached hardness, sacrifice, and suspicion of outsiders. They expected cruelty and instead were met with something almost tender. The coffee was not a feast, not a lavish banquet, but for men who had forgotten what normal life tasted like, it was extraordinary. A cup in hand, steaming in the crisp morning air, felt like proof that the world still held small mercies. As they drank, silence slowly gave way to whispers. Men exchanged looks, raising eyebrows, half smiling in disbelief. Some chuckled, shaking their heads as though mocking their own astonishment. Others leaned on the barracks walls, savoring each sip with deliberate slowness, stretching the moment into something timeless. They spoke of home, of mothers and wives who used to brew coffee in battered pots on quiet mornings before the war. They spoke of the sharp contrast, the bitter, burned taste of ersatz coffee back in Germany, made from acorns and roots that left an aftertaste of ashes. Here the flavor was smooth, rich, and entirely unthinkable for prisoners. The ritual repeated itself every day. Each morning, as the sun rose and the camp stirred awake, the same aroma drifted across the compound, summoning the prisoners with an invisible call. Coffee became the rhythm of their captivity, a strange anchor of normalcy in a world that had otherwise spun into chaos. They began to anticipate it, to look forward to it, not with desperation, but with the quiet certainty of routine. In those moments, they were not enemies. They were simply men, tired and far from home, warming their hands around a cup that carried a fragment of lost humanity. This memory clung to them long after the war ended. Veterans in their old age would recall not only the battles, the suffering, and the fear, but also this strange detail. America gave them coffee every morning. It was a story told with shaking heads and soft laughter, with a tone of disbelief that such a thing could have happened. For many, the coffee came to symbolize something greater than itself. It represented abundance in the midst of destruction, kindness in the midst of war, and the extraordinary contrast between the collapsing world they had left behind and the thriving nation in which they found themselves imprisoned. To capture the feeling of that first sip is to understand the sheer cultural shock these men experienced. It was not the taste alone, but the way it spoke to the deepest human need for dignity, comfort, and remembrance of home. The morning coffee did not erase the reality of captivity nor the guilt of defeat, but it softened the edges. For a few minutes each day, the war seemed distant, the fences invisible, and the men, though prisoners, felt human again. The shock of the coffee itself was powerful enough, but the deeper surprise lay in what it meant. For men who had been trained to expect the harshness of enemies, every sip carried a message that contradicted the very lessons hammered into them during their years in uniform. Germany's propaganda machine had long painted Americans as weak, undisciplined, incapable of true endurance. Yet here they were, prisoners in the heart of that very country, being treated with a level of civility that felt almost impossible. In the barracks at night, the whispers spread from bunk to bunk. They give us coffee every morning. Real coffee. Not substitutes, not scraps. Coffee. It was not merely sustenance, it was a challenge to their expectations, a daily reminder that the enemy they had imagined was not the enemy who stood before them. For the German prisoners, coffee carried a cultural weight that reached far beyond the surface. In Germany, it was more than a drink. It was a ritual of family, of tradition, of hospitality. A guest offered a cup of coffee felt welcomed and respected. To be handed a steaming mug by one's captors was, in its own quiet way, an act of acknowledgement. It said, "We see you not only as defeated soldiers, but as men who still deserve dignity." This subtle message unsettled many of them. They had been prepared to endure hunger and humiliation, to be broken into submission. Instead, they were confronted with a strange, almost disarming form of humanity. Some of the men tried to resist the feeling. They told themselves it was a trick, a strategy to soften them. They muttered in their native tongue that kindness was dangerous, that they should never forget these were still the enemy. Yet even as they spoke, their hands betrayed them, clutching the cup tightly for warmth, savoring the taste before swallowing, letting the steam rise into their faces with closed eyes. No amount of warning could erase the relief that flowed through their bodies with each sip. In those early weeks, the camp was filled with small moments of disbelief. Men who had been captured in battle, dragged from the mud and terror of collapsing fronts, now sat on wooden benches in the soft light of morning, drinking a beverage they hadn't tasted in years. They compared stories of the substitutes they had endured back home. One described how his wife roasted acorns until the smell filled their small kitchen, pretending it was coffee to comfort their children. Another recalled his mother boiling sugar beets, the liquid so sweet and bitter it coated the tongue with a film that lingered for hours. They laughed quietly at the absurdity of it all. Men who had once marched proudly into foreign lands, now marveling at something as simple as a cup of coffee in enemy captivity. For others, the shock cut even deeper. They remembered German officers' warnings of what capture would mean: starvation, cruelty, humiliation. These stories had filled their imaginations with fear. Yet standing in line each morning, their empty cups ready to be filled by American hands, they realized that every warning had been wrong. Instead of cruelty, there was routine. Instead of starvation, there was enough. Instead of humiliation, there was a strange, almost ordinary courtesy. The coffee was not a feast, but it was steady, dependable, and its very consistency challenged the bitterness they carried in their hearts. It became more than a drink. It became a symbol. With each morning, the steaming mugs reminded them that America was not a nation on the edge of collapse, but a land of abundance. It reminded them that despite the vast war raging across oceans, their captors chose to treat them with a level of humanity that many had never expected. The simple act of pouring coffee each day dismantled their image of Americans as decadent or weak. Instead, they began to see a nation confident enough in its strength that it could extend courtesy even to enemies. The psychological weight of this realization was heavy. Around campfires, men debated what it meant. Some argued it was a deliberate show of superiority, that America gave coffee not out of kindness, but to prove its wealth and power. Others shook their heads and said no, it was simply the way these people lived, that abundance was so common here, it flowed even into the cups of prisoners. Either way, the shock was undeniable. The coffee was not only a comfort, it was a mirror reflecting the vast differences between their crumbling homeland and this land of plenty. Over time, the coffee ritual became woven into their sense of survival. It was the moment they looked forward to each morning, the spark that carried them into another day of captivity. The prisoners began to speak of it not only as a drink, but as a lifeline. Men who had arrived in camp gaunt, hollow-eyed and defiant, softened ever so slightly, their resistance chipped away not by force, but by routine humanity. The Americans likely did not consider the psychological effect. To them, coffee was ordinary, as automatic as bread or water. But to the men who received it, the meaning was profound. Years later, many would admit that the act reshaped their understanding of the world. They had been raised in a system that glorified harshness, that saw mercy as weakness. Yet here, in captivity, their strongest memories were of being given something unnecessary but profoundly human. Each cup seemed to whisper that even in war, there were boundaries that could not be erased. They were enemies, yes, but they were also men who could hold a warm drink in their hands. Men who could feel, for a few minutes each morning, that life still held fragments of dignity. In that sense, the coffee was never just coffee. It was a challenge to their beliefs, a symbol of civility in the midst of chaos, and an unexpected bridge between captor and captive. The smell of roasted beans drifting through the camp at dawn did more to unsettle and transform the prisoners than any speech, any punishment, or any lecture could have done. It showed them a face of America that propaganda had never described, a face of abundance, of quiet strength, and of small but unforgettable mercies. As the weeks stretched into months, the ritual of morning coffee became the quiet heartbeat of camp life. In the beginning, it had been an astonishment, an indulgence so unexpected that prisoners treated it with near reverence. But over time, the act of receiving it each day, without fail, transformed astonishment into rhythm. The camp, though still marked by fences and watchtowers, began to carry the strange comfort of routine, and it was the coffee that anchored it. Long before the work details assembled or the barracks echoed with orders, the smell drifted across the compound, summoning weary men into a shared moment of pause. For men who had spent years in a world of unpredictability, where artillery shattered mornings and hunger gnawed endlessly, the predictability of coffee was more powerful than they could explain. It gave shape to their days. The prisoners would stir at dawn, pull on their worn uniforms, and line up outside the barracks, the rising steam guiding them forward. There was no mystery in it anymore, and yet it never lost its weight. The cup they received each morning became their proof that captivity was not cruelty, that they had stepped into a world where life, even behind barbed wire, carried a thread of normalcy. Conversations bloomed in those moments. Men who had marched silently beside one another on the battlefield now found themselves speaking more freely, leaning against wooden posts or sitting at makeshift benches with coffee warming their hands. They shared memories that war had long buried, stories of their childhood homes, of sisters and mothers serving breakfast, of quiet mornings on farms or in city apartments when life had felt untouched by politics and conflict. One sip could unlock decades of memory, a taste that bridged their present captivity with the ghost of their past lives. In the stillness of camp mornings, surrounded by the low hum of conversation, it was as if the war receded beyond the fences, as though the simple act of drinking together could temporarily erase the enormity of their defeat. There were men who described the coffee not as a drink, but as a companion. A hot mug pressed between their palms offered more than flavor. It gave them something to hold on to, something to linger over. It slowed time. In those precious minutes before labor or drills began, the camp shifted from a place of confinement to a place of connection. The walls of the barracks, the clink of tin cups, the faint laughter among small groups, it all became woven into a tapestry of fragile peace. Some prisoners would sip in silence, staring out at the sunrise, their thoughts lost in memory. Others would lean close together, speaking quietly in their dialects, letting the warmth loosen the bitterness that had hardened inside them since their capture. For the Americans, it was an ordinary morning. Guards poured from heavy urns without ceremony, their movements efficient, unthinking. But for the Germans, it became the center of their daily existence. They would describe later that the camp itself seemed to revolve around it. The food was adequate, the work manageable, but it was the coffee that gave everything its strange familiarity. Even the physical setting seemed to change in its presence. The barracks, stark and utilitarian, softened when the smell of roasted beans filled the air. The fences, tall and cruel, seemed less suffocating when men stood near them, talking quietly with mugs in hand. The chill of dawn, which once bit into their skin, felt more bearable when tempered by the steam rising from tin cups. Some of the men confessed that it was the closest they had come to happiness in years. Not joy in the sense of victory or freedom, but a quiet relief, a moment when they could breathe without fear, when they could feel human again. Even those who resisted, who tried to keep themselves hardened, found their defenses weakening in those mornings. Coffee was not a luxury here. It was daily, dependable, and that in itself was astonishing. It became the small miracle they leaned on, a piece of ordinary life that refused to be destroyed, even by war. The friendships that grew around those mugs were unlike any formed on the battlefield. Captivity had stripped them of rank and status. Generals and privates alike stood in the same line, held the same cup, shared the same drink. The hierarchy of war dissolved into a quiet equality. They talked not of strategy or orders, but of farms, families, dreams. One man might recall the way his mother served coffee with sweet rolls on Sundays. Another would laugh, remembering how his father scolded him for drinking it too young. These stories bound them together, making the camp less a place of isolation and more a reluctant community. The ritual also carried with it a subtle transformation of identity. They were prisoners, yes, but each sip reminded them they were also men, not merely enemies, reduced to numbers. That recognition mattered. The Americans may not have intended it, but their casual act of providing coffee created a bond of shared humanity that defied the expectations of both sides. Each morning, as steam curled into the cold air and laughter flickered between sips, the camp itself seemed to breathe differently. Over time, men began to write about it in their letters home. They described to their families in Germany, who were surviving on ersatz substitutes, how every day they drank real coffee in America. Some letters were tinged with guilt. How could they admit that as prisoners they had more than their wives and children at home? Others were written with gratitude, as if the coffee itself was proof that they had fallen into a kind of captivity more merciful than they could have imagined. Those who survived the war would recall later that the coffee was not simply remembered, it became one of the defining details of their captivity, a thread of light in the darkest chapter of their lives. The routine may have seemed simple, but to the prisoners it was profound. It gave them something to anticipate, something to savor, something that turned mornings from bleakness into a ritual of connection. In those moments, time slowed, fences blurred, and humanity returned. The war still raged outside, but inside the camp, for a few precious minutes each morning, there was peace poured into cups. To the Americans, coffee was almost invisible in its significance. It was woven into the fabric of their daily lives so tightly that no one thought to question its presence. A guard pouring steaming mugs for prisoners might have considered it little more than a routine duty, as ordinary as unlocking the barracks doors or blowing the whistle for roll call. In America, coffee was everywhere, at breakfast tables in farmhouses, in bustling city cafes, in the break rooms of factories where men and women churned out weapons for the war effort. Even in the midst of global conflict, coffee remained abundant, a symbol of the nation's industrial reach and its ability to sustain not just armies, but the ordinary comforts of civilian life. To the men in uniform who guarded the camps, it was only natural that the prisoners should receive it too. But to the prisoners themselves, each cup was nothing less than a revelation. For German POWs, the coffee represented a gulf so wide it seemed almost incomprehensible. Their families back home were surviving on thin rations, ration cards clutched in weary hands, and ersatz substitutes brewed in desperate kitchens. Civilians scoured fields and forests for acorns and roots to roast, their faces drawn with hunger, their spirits worn by endless shortages. The German homeland was a place where the aroma of real coffee had vanished years earlier, replaced by the acrid smell of substitutes that carried only bitterness. Yet here in America, even as prisoners behind barbed wire, they were given the very thing their own families were denied. The irony was sharp, almost cruel in its contrast, and yet it was also comforting. A sip of that steaming liquid connected them to a world where abundance still existed. where scarcity had not stripped dignity from daily life. Many POWs admitted later that the coffee became a lens through which they viewed the vast differences between their homeland and the United States. It was not just the drink itself, it was what it revealed. America was not starving. America was not crumbling. America had so much wealth, so much surplus, that even its enemies tasted its abundance. For men who had marched under banners declaring the Reich's supremacy, this realization was sobering. They looked around at the sturdy barracks, the organized kitchens, the endless supplies that seemed to arrive without interruption, and they understood in a way propaganda never allowed them to. The war was already lost, not just on the battlefield, but in the sheer weight of resources America could bring to bear. The guards, of course, did not consider this as they carried heavy metal urns each morning, their boots crunching against the gravel paths. To them, it was as simple as filling cups, moving the line forward, and repeating the process the next day. They did not see the stunned looks exchanged by prisoners as the liquid poured, or the quiet awe with which the Germans lifted their mugs. They could not know that behind those gazes the men were comparing two worlds, a homeland of scarcity and a captivity of plenty. In Germany, their families were rationing every crumb. In America, even prisoners of war could drink what had become almost mythical back home. Letters smuggled through censors carried hints of this astonishment. "We are treated fairly," some wrote cautiously. "We even have coffee." Families who read those words could scarcely believe them. Wives who had gone years without tasting it might have felt a pang of jealousy mixed with relief, knowing their husbands drank better in captivity than they did in their own kitchens. Mothers wept to imagine their sons sipping something that had vanished from their own tables long ago. These letters only deepened the contrast, turning coffee into a symbol of the great divide between their suffering homeland and the land of their captivity. For the prisoners themselves, the contrast sometimes carried guilt. They knew their families were tightening belts, surviving on scraps, enduring bombings and hunger, while they sat in relative comfort. Holding a hot mug of coffee, they could not help but imagine their loved ones boiling weak substitutes from roots and herbs. The thought lingered in silence between men as they drank, each swallowed sip heavy with the knowledge of what others lacked. But guilt did not erase the gratitude. The prisoners cherished what they had, even if it revealed the cruel irony of their situation. What astonished them most was the casualness with which the Americans offered it. There was no sense of triumph, no gloating, no attempt to use the coffee as leverage. It was not presented as a gift, nor as a weapon. It was simply given, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. That casual abundance struck harder than deliberate cruelty ever could. It reminded the prisoners every morning that America could afford to treat them this way, because it had more than enough. The abundance was a quiet form of power, unspoken but undeniable. Some German officers in the camps wrestled with the psychological weight of this. They tried to warn their men not to be softened, not to forget that they were still prisoners, still defeated soldiers. They cautioned that comfort could be dangerous, that it could weaken their will. But the warnings rang hollow in the face of reality. A man clutching a hot cup of coffee, steam rising against the dawn air, could not deny the comfort he felt. The ritual was too steady, too human, too ordinary to be ignored. Even the most hardened among them had to admit, if only to themselves, that captivity in America was nothing like what they had been taught to expect. And so, every morning, the same contrast played out silently. German prisoners, wrapped in the fatigue of defeat, stood in line behind barbed wire and received the same drink that Americans poured freely at their own breakfast tables. Each sip deepened their understanding of how far their world had fallen and how different life was across the ocean. The coffee did not erase their defeat, but it gave it meaning. It showed them that the world was not uniform, that power was not only measured in weapons, but in the ability to preserve even the smallest comforts in times of war. This revelation stayed with them long after they were released, long after they returned to a Germany scarred and starving. Many remembered those mornings not as luxuries, but as quiet revelations. They had expected hunger and humiliation, but instead they had been handed mugs filled with warmth, symbols of abundance that their homeland could no longer provide. The Americans had not needed to speak the message aloud. The coffee spoke it for them. Years slipped into decades, yet for many German veterans, when memories of captivity returned, it was not always the barbed wire, the watchtowers, or the endless roll calls that stood at the forefront of their minds. It was the coffee. That steaming mug, handed to them in the chill of an American dawn, lingered with a clarity that even time could not erode. In conversations years later, when men gathered in quiet reunions or sat alone with grandchildren asking about the war, their voices often softened when they spoke of those mornings. The bitterness of defeat, the shame of capture, and the exhaustion of war seemed to dissolve into the memory of that simple, ordinary, extraordinary act. For many, the coffee became a symbol of something larger than itself. It was not the drink alone that stayed with them, but what it represented. They had gone into captivity expecting to be broken, treated as less than men, reduced to hunger and humiliation. Instead, every morning they were given something unnecessary yet profoundly human. That warmth in their hands, rising into their faces with steam that blurred the fences around them, told them in ways words never could that their captors recognized their dignity. They were prisoners, yes, but they were also men. That recognition, wrapped in the ordinary gesture of pouring coffee, carried a weight far beyond its simplicity. When the war ended and they were eventually released, many returned to a homeland that lay in ruins. Cities reduced to rubble, railways twisted into wreckage, factories silent under collapsed roofs. Germany had become unrecognizable. Families starved in shattered houses. Streets echoed with the cries of children whose fathers had not returned. In that world of devastation, memories of captivity in America often felt strangely out of place. Some veterans spoke quietly, almost in guilt, of how they had been given more in captivity than their families had in freedom. The coffee, in particular, became a point of comparison. While their wives and mothers had boiled acorn substitutes and strained every root and herb for some semblance of flavor, the prisoners had drunk real coffee every morning. The irony was sharp, and for some painful to admit, and yet it was not guilt alone that lingered. There was also gratitude. For men who had seen war in its rawest form, who had faced the cold indifference of death on the battlefield, the memory of being treated with unexpected humanity mattered. They carried it with them into peacetime, sometimes unspoken, sometimes shared in hushed tones, but always remembered. Coffee became shorthand for an experience that defied their expectations, an experience that reminded them that even in the darkest chapters of human history, light could still break through in the smallest of ways. In memoirs and interviews decades later, German veterans would speak of their captivity with surprising nuance. They remembered the work details, the long months, the yearning for freedom. But almost without fail, when asked what stood out most, they returned to that daily ritual. "They gave us coffee," some would say simply, as if those 4 words carried more weight than entire chapters of suffering. Others described the smell, the warmth, the taste, as though reliving it with each retelling. What astonished their listeners often was not the fact of coffee itself, but the emotion with which the men remembered it. It was not nostalgia for luxury, it was reverence for humanity. For some, the coffee became a bridge, softening the distance between enemies. Decades after the war, when reconciliation began to grow between nations, when former soldiers met across old battle lines, that shared memory of coffee often surfaced. It was a detail that humanized both sides. The Americans, who had thought nothing of providing it, learned how deeply it had mattered. The Germans, who had never expected such treatment, carried it as a reminder that their captors had chosen humanity when cruelty would have been easier. The ritual of coffee, repeated every day without fail, became a quiet marker of dignity in captivity. It was not a grand gesture, not a feast or a celebration, but a steady, dependable act that restored something fundamental. In a world defined by destruction, it reminded them that not everything had been lost. The small comfort of a warm drink, offered without hesitation, rebuilt in them a sense of self that war had threatened to erase. Even decades later, when their bodies had aged and their memories blurred, that taste remained vivid. Many who returned home would tell their families and children that the strangest part of captivity was not the fences or the guards, but the fact that every morning, without fail, they drank coffee. Their listeners would often react with disbelief, sometimes even laughter, unable to reconcile the brutality of global war with something so gentle. Yet for the men who lived it, that contradiction was the truth. The brutality and the gentleness existed side by side, and it was the latter that left the more enduring mark. As years turned into lifetimes, and the veterans passed into history, the memory of those mornings did not vanish. It was preserved in memoirs, in oral histories, in whispered stories shared at tables with family members who leaned close to catch every word. In those retellings, the coffee always appeared, not as a footnote, but as a central thread. It was the taste of dignity in captivity, the smell of humanity in a world that had otherwise lost itself to hatred and destruction. It was proof, carried across decades, that even in the darkest times, kindness could persist in the smallest, most ordinary rituals. The image remained vivid until the end of their days. The camp at dawn, the line of weary men, the guard pouring from a heavy urn, and the cup warming their hands. Beyond the fences the war raged on. Beyond the fences cities burned. But inside that compound every morning there was coffee. And for many German prisoners, that was what they remembered most. Not the defeat, not the captivity, but the strange, almost unthinkable comfort of a cup that reminded them they were still human.